The moment they told Aarav Mehta to leave his seat, something inside him broke, not loudly, not visibly, but in the quiet, heavy way that only a father carrying too much can understand. The bright daylight streaming through the airplane windows made everything sharper, harsher, the judgment in the flight attendants' eyes, the impatient glances from other passengers, and the confusion on his little daughter's face as she clutched his hand tighter, sensing something was wrong but not yet understanding what. He had paid for those seats with the last of his savings, hoping to give his daughter, Kiara, a small sense of comfort after months of instability. But now, standing in the narrow aisle with people staring and whispering, he was being told that his tickets had been reassigned due to an operational adjustment. The polite words didn't soften the reality, they were being downgraded to economy, pushed to the back like an afterthought. Before we go any further, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and standing up for what's right, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Lifeline Tales. Stories like this remind us that even in the hardest moments, humanity can shine through. Aarav didn't argue. He didn't have the energy for it. Life had already drained him in ways most people couldn't see. Just a year ago, he had been a successful aviation engineer with a steady career, a comfortable home, and a family that felt whole. But tragedy doesn't knock politely, it crashes in unannounced and takes everything with it. His wife, Nina, had passed away after a sudden illness, leaving him alone with a 5-year-old daughter and a world that suddenly felt too large and too empty at the same time. Grief had cost him more than just emotional strength. It had affected his work, his focus, and eventually, his job. Bills piled up. The house was sold. What remained was a father trying desperately to keep his daughter's world from collapsing completely. This trip wasn't for luxury, it was for hope. A final interview in another city, a chance to rebuild, to give Kiara stability again. As they made their way to the cramped economy seats, Kiara looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. The kind that trust you to make everything okay, even when you're not sure how. Aarav forced a smile, brushing her hair gently, pretending this was all part of the plan. Inside, though, the humiliation burned. The hours passed slowly. Kiara eventually fell asleep against his arm, her small fingers still wrapped around his shirt as if letting go might make him disappear too. Aarav stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by, wondering how life had changed so drastically in such a short time. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of fighting, tired of losing, tired of pretending everything would be okay. But life has a strange way of circling back when you least expect it. As the plane began its descent, something unusual happened. The aircraft slowed more than expected, then came to a halt on the taxiway instead of proceeding to the gate. Passengers began murmuring, glancing around in confusion. A faint tension filled the cabin. Even the crew seemed unsettled. Minutes turned into longer, uneasy stretches. Then came the announcement, there was a delay due to an unexpected runway obstruction. No further details. Aarav barely paid attention at first. Delays were common. But then he noticed something through the window. A sleek private jet stood across the runway, positioned in a way that clearly wasn't accidental. It wasn't moving, wasn't taxiing, it was simply there. Blocking everything. Passengers craned their necks, whispering. The crew exchanged worried looks. This wasn't normal protocol. Airport authorities were likely scrambling behind the scenes. And then, slowly, realization dawned. Aarav leaned closer to the window, his breath catching. The jet's design, the custom paint, the insignia near the tail, it was unmistakable. He had worked on that aircraft years ago. Designed part of its navigation system himself. It belonged to a major aviation conglomerate, one known for its precision, discipline, and absolute adherence to protocol. They would never block a runway without reason. Something bigger was happening. Inside the airport control tower, calls were being made. Orders were being issued. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the cabin door opened. A senior airport official stepped inside, followed by a sharply dressed man whose presence commanded attention without effort. Conversations fell silent as he walked down the aisle, scanning faces with quiet intensity. When his eyes landed on Aarav, he stopped. The recognition was immediate. Years ago, Aarav had worked under him, not just as an employee, but as one of the brightest minds in the company. The man had admired his work, trusted his instincts. But when Aarav disappeared after his wife's passing, no one had known why. He had simply vanished from the professional world. And now, here he was. Sitting in economy. Looking worn, defeated, and yet still holding on to dignity in the only way he knew how, by staying silent. The man stepped closer, his expression softening. The entire cabin watched as something unspoken passed between them: respect, regret, understanding. What followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. The official turned to the crew, issuing quiet but firm instructions. Within minutes, the situation began to change. Apologies were offered. Seats were rearranged. But more than that, a message had been sent, not just to the airline staff, but to everyone watching. The private jet on the runway hadn't been there by accident. It had been a deliberate act, a pause forced into a system that had overlooked someone who once helped build it. Aarav was escorted back to the front, but this time, it wasn't about status. It was about recognition. Kiara woke up as they moved, blinking in confusion. Aarav held her close, whispering reassurance, though his own emotions were tangled. Gratitude mixed with something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The flight eventually reached the gate, but the story didn't end there. Outside the aircraft, the same man waited. Not as a superior, not as a distant executive, but as someone who remembered. He didn't offer empty words or grand gestures. Instead, he offered something far more meaningful: a second chance. Aarav's skills hadn't faded. His brilliance hadn't disappeared. It had simply been buried under grief and survival. And now, it was being seen again. Days later, Aarav stood in a new office, not luxurious, not overwhelming, but filled with possibility. Kiara sat nearby, drawing pictures with a smile that had slowly returned to her face. For the first time in months, the weight on his chest felt lighter. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing never is. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one person willing to stop the world, even just for a few minutes, to remind you that you still matter. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, share, and comment. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life, stories that remind us of the power of kindness and second chances. And before we reach the end, here's something special. Comment below with the word hope if you believe that no matter how hard life gets, there's always a way forward. Because in the end, it wasn't the private jet or the runway that changed Aarav's life. It was the simple, powerful act of being seen again. And sometimes, that's all a person needs to rise.